everyone's calls out of the box and come up with new approaches. Okay? Any questions or comments on that? Okay. All right, let's take a look at functional behavioral assessment. Okay? What you're going to be wanting to do is clearly describing the challenging behaviors, especially those that occur together. Okay? It's pretty rare that we have a student with one behavior only. Okay? That's pretty rare. That all of the behaviors are pretty good, they just do this one thing. Okay? So there could be a group of behaviors that are meeting the same function for the student. Okay? And when you're doing the functional behavioral assessment, you want to identify what are the specific places, times, and situations where that behavior will occur, and then really, really important, when does the behavior not occur? Because that always gives us really good information. When is the behavior not happening? Okay? Because most behaviors are not happening 100% of the time, every day of the week, every time. Even though it feels that way, even though when we go and meet with the teacher, we often get this, it's happening constantly, it's happening all the time. And it does feel that way. But once you start doing some data collection, you start to identify, well, maybe it's happening more just before snack time. Or maybe it's happening more on the day that we have art. You know, whatever specific things are coming out of your data. And then once you've taken a look at this, you come up with your best guess. Okay? You're taking a guess and you're describing everything. You're guessing what is it that reinforces the behavior. Okay? You're making a guess, your hypothesis. Now the part that describes the behavior, that's not a guess. You've got data on that. So you've got your hypothesis, you're describing the situation, and you're talking about when it will occur, and hopefully you're pretty on target about what are the reinforcers that are maintaining the behavior. But sometimes you're not quite sure, and that's okay. It's your first guess, your first hypothesis. All right, so we've got a couple of big ideas about functional assessment of behavior. Okay? This is going to help us improve our understanding of the problem behavior, and that's going to help us take a look at how we can be more efficient and effective in developing those behavior support plans. And also, you're identifying the various events that are going to help you predict, again, when the behavior will occur, when the behavior will not occur. So you're playing Sherlock Holmes here. You're saying, what are the things that are making the behavior happen? What are the elements? If they're not present, we don't see the behavior. So once you've gone through the process of your functional behavioral assessment, what are you going to have? What are you going to have once you've gone through this process? You're going to have an operational description of the behavior. You're going to have some data collection. And you're going to look at the consequences that are maintaining the behavior. Again, this is not punishments. This is not, so, you know, the kid gets to, you know, I'm going to yell at the kid. That's the consequence. No, you're going to look at, is the student getting attention? Is the student getting to escape? Those are the types of consequences that we're going to be looking at. Then you're going to do some predicting about when the behavior will occur. What are the various situations, times? What are the environmental variables that impact seeing this behavior? And then you come up with your hypothesis of why you think the student is engaging in this behavior. Okay, so these are the various components that are going to be included. Okay? Always start with strengths perspective. What is the client or student good at? What would be a good reason to include the student's strengths? Any thoughts? Why we take the time to look at strengths? Yes? Okay, thank you. You look at the strengths when you're talking about interventions. Okay? So you're not looking at interventions yet when you're doing the FBA. But down the road, you're going to use the FBA to develop your BIP, your behavior intervention plan. And if you know the student's strengths, then those can be used as you're developing your interventions. Okay? Next, you want a clear description of the target behavior. And this can sometimes take some time, because maybe the student has 5 or 6 challenging behaviors. We're not going to do an FBA on 6 behaviors. So what you need to do is identify the one behavior that you want to start with, that you want to focus on first. Okay? So out of the 6 behaviors that are frustrating, which one is the one that's the highest on the priority list, that will make the most impact on the classroom environment? Which one behavior are you going to collect data on? Again, you can't collect data on 6 behaviors at once. You won't get anything else done during the day. Okay? So to get the individuals on the team to come to consensus as to what is the target behavior. Okay? Then we're going to be looking at the setting. Where does the behavior occur? And antecedents. What are the things that are happening right before the behavior occurs? And that can often be challenging to identify. And a lot of times we hear, it can be anything. It can be any reason. It can be for no reason. It just appears out of the blue. And through careful observation, that's where you have to kind of narrow that down. And it could be just out of the blue. It could be an internal, organic reason that we're not aware of, and the child doesn't have the communication skills to let us know. Maybe the child has a toothache, can't explain that to us. There could be various reasons. But still we make the attempt. What are the antecedents? What are the things that are happening right before this behavior? Then what are the consequences? Meaning, what does the student get out of engaging in the behavior? The consequence is not the child gets sent to the principal's office, or the child stands in the corner, or the child gets his name written on the board. Okay? The consequence is what is the student deriving from the behavior. Okay? And we look at the environmental variables, what's going on. Is it weather? Is it medication? Did the child not have breakfast that day? Did the child have to wear the scratchy socks this morning because the favorite socks aren't clean? Were we out of Rice Krispies and I had to eat Cheerios? Did somebody call me a name on the bus? So many environmental variables that we might not be aware of. And again, then we come up with our hypothesis of the function of the behavior. Okay? Is the student getting something out of it or escaping something? What's the student getting out of engaging in the behavior in that environment? All right, so when we look at a behavior definition, we want to include 5 elements. Okay? The topography is just kind of a general description of the behavior. What does it look like? If I'm telling you about this behavior and describing it to you, what am I seeing? Okay? Then you want to include the frequency. Okay? So it's happening all the time. Well, maybe it's happening 3 times per hour. Maybe it's happening 5 times per hour. Maybe it's a behavior that's happening twice a day. Okay? You want to look at the frequency. The latency, this one is always very challenging, because the latency is the time between the trigger and seeing the behavior. Okay? You're not always going to be able to know the answer to that question. But if it's a student who gets tapped on the shoulder in the hallway and then comes into class and starts screaming, you've got a couple minutes in there. Maybe the student got frustrated, thought somebody was harassing them, but it was really a mistake, and they come into the classroom very frustrated. Okay? Duration, how long is the behavior lasting? Okay? Is the student lying on the floor, kicking and screaming? Is that going on for 10 minutes? Is the behavior just, very brief? And then the magnitude is the strength of the behavior. Okay? If the student hit the locker, did they just kind of punch it a little? Did they punch it hard enough to make a dent? Did they slam it? If the student is yelling, is it noises that can be heard within the classroom, or is it noises that can be heard 3 classrooms away? Okay, so the strength or magnitude of the behavior. Now this is something new that's been added to the functional behavioral assessments in Illinois in the last couple of years, is they want us to take a look at whether it's a skill deficit or a performance deficit. What does that mean to you guys? Skill versus performance. What does that mean? Any thoughts? Because it's on that checklist. We have to check it off. Yes?
Do they not know how to do it, or do they know who is choosing?
Okay, thank you. So if it's a skill deficit, do they know how to do it? Okay? A skill is, do they know how to do it? If it's a performance deficit, you're saying they know how to do the skill, but for whatever reason, they're not performing the skill. Okay? And we have it right here. Skill, they can't do it. Performance, they know how, but they're not consistently doing it. Maybe they're doing it every once in a while. If it's a skill deficit, then we teach them the skill. If it's a performance deficit, we take a look at why they're not using the skill. Why are they sometimes using the skill? Do they need additional training? Is it the reinforcement? Is it the prompting? Okay, in your packet, in packet number 2, you have a description of a student, Maddie. Okay, let's just take a minute to read about Maddie. You have a list of the 5 categories from a complete behavior definition. What you've read is a typical description of behavior. Think about any assumptions or judgments that might be in there. And then use this information to identify the components of Maddie's behavior on this next page. Okay? For topography, what does Maddie's behavior look like? Okay, what are we seeing? What are we seeing when we look at Maddie's behavior? Yes? She's talking back. And what else? Talking back. She's refusing to do her work. What does it look like when she refuses to do her work? What am I seeing? How do I know that she's refusing to do her work? Okay, yes?
She talks back.
She talks back. She keeps asking for help. You'd see her asking repeatedly for help. Okay, what else? What do we see? What other behaviors are we seeing with Maddie? Tantrums, and what are these tantrums looking like? How do I know it's a tantrum?
Crying, screaming.
Okay, we see crying, we see screaming. She's slapping the desk. Okay, so that's what a tantrum looks like for Maddie's. Crying, screaming, slapping the desk.
That's not in there.
Oh, so slapping the desk is not in there? Somebody read ahead. Somebody read ahead.
I would say that's not really a good explanation.
Okay. How about frequency? How often is this happening?
Twice a day.
Okay, some behaviors are happening twice a day.
Once a week.
Some are happening once a week. Okay, so that's something that would need to be kind of defined a little more clearly. Latency. Latency. Any time period, but yes.
Within 3 minutes of initiating independent work?
Okay, so within 3 minutes of being asked to do independent work. Okay, so, pardon? Is that from reading ahead too?
Yeah, it must be because it's
Oh, okay. People are reading ahead. We want just the information from here.
I'd say the latency is very
Okay. Not in there. Not in there. Duration?
I guess maybe a few minutes.
Okay, so we had a guess of a few minutes. Okay? Again, we're working off the original behavior description. Okay? So the latency wasn't in there, the duration wasn't in there. How about magnitude? Was that in the original description? No. Okay. So somebody took their time. Somebody took their time to write this entire page. Okay? Good 5-10 minutes somebody took. But it's missing a lot of the key information that we need in order to proceed. Okay? Any judgments in there? Any judgments in there? Okay, what did we see that's a judgment? Yes? Problems at home. Okay, we got a judgment there. Anything else? Difficult. That it's a difficult family. That's definitely a judgment. Damien?
She doesn't like to do her work?
She doesn't like to do her work. That's definitely a judgment. She doesn't get the attention that she wants. Judgment, a lot of judgments. Okay? So, again, when you're writing your behavior descriptions, remember to stick to the facts. Okay? What can we see? What can we observe? What do we hear? Okay? Strictly observable data. If we have a behavior description that says, Maddie has a tantrum 3 times per day, and you're the teacher and you've written that, and you have the social worker coming in to help you with data collection, how does the social worker know when it's a tantrum? Okay? Maybe your definition of tantrum and the social worker's definition of tantrum are not the same thing. Perhaps at the first throwing of a book on the floor, in your mind, that's a tantrum. Maybe in the social worker's mind, it's not until the student has thrown herself on the floor that it becomes a tantrum. Okay? So, very clear explanation of what it is you will be seeing when you see a tantrum. Okay? Now that you have that information, can you write out a definition of Maddie's behavior? How you would write it?
Based on just that first or now?
You know what? We've got this additional data that you can include here. Okay? The behavior is occurring in clusters. starts with whining. It will escalate into what we're calling a tantrum if it's allowed. As we said, within 3 minutes of initiating independent work, the talking and delaying are going to continue throughout the task. The tantrums continue until the point where she's removed from the classroom. And we've got some information on magnitude. It can be heard throughout the room with the screaming, crying, and slapping on the desk. And the sounds and tears kind of increase with time.
Information, or, I mean, it says labels, which I don't like, but it says she has a learning disability. We don't know what it is.
Right?
We don't know if it's the particular topic, or whether it's all day long. It just seems like there's information missing. Is it that she doesn't like the work and she can't do it?
That absolutely is missing. So the question is, does she not like the work? Can she just not do it? Or is there some other reason? Absolutely. And when you do the functional behavioral assessment, those are the types of questions you're going to ask. That's the information you're going to be looking for. Absolutely. Yes?
We're writing out
The definition.
the definition
Of Maddie's behavior. Have a question?
Feels like you should probably interview the child to actually get a real definition of the behavior.
Okay, great. So you're seeing how challenging this can be before you actually have more of this information. Absolutely. And that's positive, because in order to get the complete definition, you do need more information. So we're just kind of going off of what we have here for purposes of this exercise, and it's not going to be the ideal situation. And we're going to take a look at what are some of the other components that you're going to need to do this effectively. Okay, anybody want to volunteer what they've come up with? Volunteers? What have we come up with here? Yes?
Just to figure it out, it is attention deficit disorder.
That's your definition of the behavior? You're moving to kind of a diagnosis?
Generalizing or going to specific things.
Okay, following the format that maybe you'd plug into the functional behavioral assessment, how would we define her behavior? Yes?
I put within 3 minutes of doing independent work, Maddie will talk back and refuse. When the teacher is unable to help her, her behavior will escalate to crying, screaming, and slapping of desk.
Okay, that's a very clear description of what we're going to see. Okay, so did everybody hear? Could you read it? Could you read it again?
Sure. Within 3 minutes of doing independent work, Maddie will talk back and refuse. When the teacher is unable to help her, her behavior escalates to crying, screaming, and slapping of desk.
Okay, so that is a very good summary of what we would see, about how long it would last, about how long between the trigger and what we would see. So within 3 minutes of independent work, she initiates the following behaviors. Okay, why don't we take a 15-minute break and then we'll come back and continue. Out there, okay? We have a question about whether or not a child needs to have an ED label in order to have a behavior intervention plan. And my understanding is you do not need to have an ED label before you write a behavior intervention plan, but in fact, having a behavior intervention plan in place needs to occur before you would even consider the ED label for the student. Is that the general understanding of everyone else here? Yes, okay. So once you write the behavior intervention plan, it does become part of the IEP. Yes?
What's the ED?
ED is emotional disturbance. And for students who are at Phil Rock Center and have the deaf-blind category, a lot of them have strong emotional components to that as well already. But in mainstream, in other school settings, you would take a look at whether or not you would add on that secondary characteristic of emotional disturbance on top of the hearing impairment, and that makes the student eligible for additional services. Okay?
Well, also we have lots of kids with ADHD.
Okay. So some students have ADHD.
And so we do a lot of accommodations,
Okay.
you know, and some medical interventions.
Okay.
Because it's more of a problem attending than actual behavior.
All right, so if a student has ADHD, you're coming up with accommodations, and it's the attention component as opposed to the emotional component. A lot of students with ADHD might have a secondary category of OHI, other health impaired, and so those needs would be addressed through that category. So just because you have ADHD, you wouldn't necessarily qualify for the ED characteristic on your IEP. All right, let's backtrack just a second on our handouts. We did not have a perfect match here between handout and overhead, so let's go back for just a minute. When we were talking about the secondary level interventions, on page 3 of your handout, you could see that there are some examples of the check-in, check-out intervention that I was talking about, where you've got a student who maybe across days, maybe just in the morning and the afternoon, they get a 1, a 2, or a 3. Or maybe another student who, throughout the day, they get the 1, the 2, or the 3. This is a check-in, check-out program for a student. And what that means is, at the end of each time period, they're checking in with their teacher or aide or whoever is designated as their check-in person. They're getting that consistent, regular feedback on their behavior. Okay? So these are some sample forms, and if you were ever interested in using this intervention, ISRC has these samples available. Also, on the handout, it talks a little bit about when a behavior intervention plan is required, also on page 3 of your handout at the bottom. What you want to look at is, does the child's behavior impede their own or learning of others? Their own learning or the learning of others? Is the behavior interfering with that? Okay. Also, if you are a school that suspends students, anytime the number of days of suspension reaches 10 days, a behavior intervention plan needs to be in place. Also, this is particular to Illinois. The first 2 are federal. The third point is an Illinois law that if any restrictive interventions are going to be used, they need to be documented on the behavior intervention plan. And what do we mean by restrictive interventions? Okay, the next slide on your paper shows you a list of some non-restrictive and restrictive interventions. So non-restrictive interventions are just general good classroom practices. Okay, a verbal reprimand, modeling peer involvement, some sort of token economy that you have put together. But when you move into